He died thinking I denied him, and to this day, no one knows it was for love. But now that time is running out, I need to tell you what I did. My name is Anna Miriam Goldstein. I have 83 years old, and I live alone in an old wooden house at the end of a street forgotten by time, where the windows creak as if they were keeping secrets. I was a field nurse. I stitched wounds in silence and prayed for soldiers whose names no one remembers anymore. But there is only one name that I have never been able to forget. I carry in the folds of my heart a guilt that no one saw, that of having pretended not to recognize the man I loved the most, while he bled in front of me. I am one of those women who lived in the shadow of heroes, but who keeps a story of war, care, and forbidden love. A story that no one has ever heard, but that now needs to be told. Sit here with me, dear. Take a deep breath, because what I'm going to tell you now isn't easy. This story remained silent for many years, silent inside me. But today, I need someone to listen to me with an open heart. Maybe it's you. Maybe only you can understand what it means to love and not be able to say. So stay here. Don't be in a hurry. Hold my hand, even if it's just in your thoughts. And if this story touches some forgotten part of you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the others I'm going to tell you. Like this video if you can. It shows me it was worth waiting so long to speak. And if you know someone who also carries hidden memories, share them with that person. Because some stories weren't made to sleep in silence. They were just waiting for the right moment to wake up. I don't know who will find this, or if anyone will find it. Maybe I'll stay here folded between the pages of an old book or slip by mistake between the sheets of my bed. Like so many other things that age makes me forget. But today my hands shook more than usual when I picked up that yellowed page. The same one as always, the one that bears at the top the name that I could never say out loud. Benjamin Levi. I kept this letter for so long that I honestly don't remember when I first wrote it. It was rewritten over the years, you know. Every line erased, every paragraph crossed out, every hesitant comma, as if my heart was trying to find the courage my lips never had. And yet, the envelope remains there, unstamped, undated, unaddressed. Because deep down I always knew there was no more possible address. I met him at a time when the world only knew how to scream. They screamed orders, screams of fear, screams of command, screams of mourning. And we only wanted to whisper secrets, between one surgery and another, between one injury and another, between the exhausting routine and the bad news. There was a small space, almost invisible, where our eyes met. It was there, in that crack in the chaos, that he made me forget that I was just a rookie nurse, with the Star of David hanging around my neck and my soul in tatters. Benjamin. He was everything I couldn't touch. And yet, I played. I remember with painful clarity the day we first crossed paths. We were at the Fort Dix medical camp. I was carrying a tray of gauze and morphine, tripping over my own legs, and he came to help me. With a smirk, as if he already knew that my stumble wasn't just my body. He said something silly. Something about the shoes I was wearing being unfit for war. I laughed, for the first time in weeks. That small, shy laugh was the trigger for a moving story that no one could have ever imagined, much less approved. Because you see, I was the daughter of a tradition that tolerated no deviations. The daughter of a woman who prayed every morning that I would return whole, without stains, without scandals. And Benjamin, well, he was the kind of man the world didn't want me to love. Not just because he was in uniform, not just because he carried the dirt of the front on his back, but because he was too free for the mold in which I had been raised. Our forbidden love was born, like flowers are born in concrete, silent, stubborn, and impossible. During the days of service, between one bandage and another, our hands would meet as if they had a life of their own. Sometimes by accident, sometimes by necessity. But the truth, it was desire. It was the need to breathe. It was the only respite we had amidst so much smell of ether, so many cries of pain, so much death knocking at the door. I used to hide the trembling of my hands by putting my fingers in my pockets. He pretended to read reports while watching me from the corner of his eye. It was a silent but vivid theater. Over time, our story became a labyrinth of gestures. A coffee left silently on the edge of my table. A sentence cut off in the middle, afraid of who would hear. A look that lasted half a second longer than allowed. That was what our wartime love was based on. What could not be said. And my God, how that can hurt more than any scream. I wrote this letter the first night he didn't come back from patrol. They told me they were on a rotation, that they would be back the next morning. But I knew. I felt it in my body. It was as if a part of me had emptied out. And then I wrote. I wrote like someone screaming without sound. Like someone bleeding without a wound. It was supposed to be just a note. It turned into a rant. It turned into a plea. And finally, it turned into silence. Over the decades, this sheet of paper has aged with me. It has become fragile at the edges, yellowed like the memories that time has tried to steal. But I have never been able to throw it away, because this letter, it is all that is left. The only proof that that love happened, that forbidden love existed even if no one heard, even if no one allowed it, even if no one believed it. Sometimes I wonder if other women did the same, if other forgotten heroines also kept unsent letters, notes under their pillows, reliquaries of a love that war silenced. I believe so. War took more than lives. It tore away futures. And those who remained like me carried not only the mourning of bodies, but the mourning of possibilities. Today, when the sound of the rain hits my bedroom window and my bones ache more than usual, I look at this letter and think, if I had sent it, would it have come back? Or was our fate already sealed before our first touch? But there's no way to know anymore. And maybe it doesn't matter. Because as long as this letter exists, as long as my heart still beats slowly, like a war drum that refuses to stop, he is still alive, even if only here, even if only with me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get my coat. The wind seems colder today, and my memory, oh my memory, is feeling more sensitive than usual. And there's something in the air. Something that makes me want to reread this letter one more time. Not to understand, but to remember. To remember what we were, and what could have been. That fabric still lives in my living room, stored inside an old trunk, next to sepia photographs and medals that I never had the courage to wear around my neck again. The raw cotton shirt, a beige tone almost the same as the sand that covered the roads of Fort Dix, lies folded between delicate lace, as if it were a forgotten treasure. Every time my fingers touch that fabric, my chest tightens, not only from the weight of memories, but from the intensity of a moving story that has never lost the freshness of the early days. He wore that shirt like someone wearing hope. The scent was discreet, almost shy, but still capable of challenging the sharp smell of blood and disinfectant that permeated the corridors of the infirmary. It was a scent of suspended time, a perfume that took me away from the shouts of command and the moans of pain. I remember smelling it in silence, my heart racing, as if searching for scraps of life in each thread, pieces of a forbidden love that insisted on living even in the midst of chaos. One afternoon, before a patrol that seemed to have no end, Benjamin clumsily entered the trailer where I was resting for a few minutes. The lanterns were off, but the faint light of dusk filtered through the cracks in the canvas. He dropped his shirt on my desk, as if placing a burden, but also as if confiding a secret. His eyes met mine, and that moment was so intense that I was sure that if the others could see it, they would condemn our gesture. I remained still, sitting on the cold metal chair, holding the fabric as if embracing a vague promise. "Keep it," he whispered, his voice trembling as if he were walking the path of doubt. "You'll need it," I added without thinking. And it was true, because I needed something to remind me that even when the world was falling apart at my feet, there was still a breath of fresh air between us, a fragment of calm. Ever since, that piece of cloth has become my silent confidant. On the days when war magazines would come out with devastating headlines, "Battle lost, soldiers missing," I would press it to my face and feel, for a brief second, Benjamin's voice calling my name. "Anna!" That's what he called me, in a hoarse, sweet tone. A tone I had never heard out loud, but which echoed in every fold of my shirt. Over time, the fabric lost its freshness, the colors faded, and the delicate perfume became an almost imperceptible memory. But on some silent mornings when the sun floods the room and the silence weighs down like a blanket, I still bring it to my nose and close my eyes. I feel the metallic taste of longing, a mixture of melancholy and tenderness. It is at that moment that I remember his hands, firm and hesitant, that held my face before each goodbye. It was the only gesture of tenderness in a world crossed by explosions and sirens. Such a small gesture, but capable of sustaining what was left of my faith in better days. With each touch, my mind travels back to that episode, when the shirt was held back in the dirty laundry stash. A failure in the camp's laundry system caused hundreds of uniforms to be returned to the infirmary, and among them was the item that smelled like him. For a moment I feared that they had mixed it up, that my courage would disappear along with the fabric. But there it was, the yellowed cotton, with the pocket torn, where my finger had gotten caught while putting it away. I kept the dried blood stain, as if it were my own trophy. That night I sat on the old wooden bench that still stands by the window in the sewing room, and I spent hours there, feeling the fibers swell beneath my wrinkled hands. I remembered every moment those same fibers had been pressed against his chest. Every wrinkle in the shirt corresponded to a shared laugh, a silent tear, a suppressed sigh. It was as if the garment had absorbed our entire lives, a reliquary woven from the threads of a wartime love. And then, as if in a ritual, I wrapped the shirt in a white linen handkerchief and hid it back in that trunk. The grandchildren look curiously at the old box, but I simply tell them that it is a box of Grandma's things, things so personal that their children would not understand. I prefer to leave it as a mystery, a veiled invitation for them to one day ask themselves, could this also be part of a forgotten heroine? Because in the end that's what we were. Forgotten heroines on a battlefield that never existed in the history books. We are the ones who carry the scars of a love that war tried to bury, but that refused to die. And every time I take the shirt out of the trunk, I feel like I'm shaking off the dust of time, ready to resurrect the silence of the promises we made. Now, something is troubling me again. The wind has changed, bringing with it a scent of distant rain, and my heart trembled as I imagined Benjamin arriving, bringing a new message, not written, but latent in the air. Did he feel the same shiver? Did he, at some point in the world or in time, think of us again? But that answer will remain pending, and it is precisely this echo of endless questions that reminds me There is much more to tell. So, I leave here, next to the shirt, the invitation for you to follow me to the next secret kept in the trunk of my memory. There are memories that cannot be erased, neither with time nor with silence. They resist like burning embers under the snow, hidden, but alive. And if I close my eyes now, I can return to that dawn as if it were leaning here against the window frame, breathing along with me. The sky was opaque, the stars had disappeared, and the lanterns had been turned off as a precaution. Fear of aerial bombardment. The world for the first time seemed swallowed by a dark blanket. And it was exactly there, in that darkness made of fear and desire, that I broke all the doctrines that had been sewn into me. He went behind the supply tent, among the boxes of bandages and cans of preserves, where no one passed curfew. I was on the lookout. At least that's what the papers said. But my heart knew he was coming. Benjamin was punctual for the meetings we never scheduled. He came like warm winds before the rain, unannounced, but with an invisible promise of transformation. That night was no different, and even with my eyes covered by the shade of the tarp, I recognized him by the sound of his footsteps, by the way his breathing changed when he saw me. "You know this is crazy," I whispered, feeling my own voice tremble like a loose electrical wire. "The whole world is at war, Anna. Loving you is the only part that feels sane to me." He replied. It was there, without us needing to say anything else. That kiss. Oh, that kiss was the most silent and most resounding in my entire emotional story, because even without a single sound, it screamed everything that war had forbidden us to live. It was like disobeying my mother, my faith, my country, and my own fears, all at the same time. My mouth, which spent its days repeating medical protocols and the names of the wounded, for the first time said yes, without a single word. He held me with his hands covered in dirt, but it was the purest touch I had ever felt. We didn't exchange full names. There was no time, no safety. No one could know. Nurses don't get involved. Jewish women don't mix. Dutiful daughters don't kiss soldiers behind tents, their knees shaking and their souls burning. But I wasn't any of those things that night. I was just a woman, in love. And Benjamin? He was a forbidden love that saved me from the collapse of living without poetry. When he pulled me slowly, as if apologizing before the kiss happened, my body responded as if it had been waiting for it for centuries. It was a calm kiss, but with urgency inside, as if our hearts raced as our mouths slowly touched. I remember the taste of the cold on his skin, the roughness of his lips bruised by the wind, the stubble brushing lightly against my chin. It was there, in that brief touch, that we promised everything, even though we knew nothing could be fulfilled. The unlit lanterns protected us, but they also hid how much we were trembling. I was trembling because of what I felt, and he was trembling perhaps because of what he knew, that we would have no future, that this was our only chance, that war is not moved by promises. And yet, even surrounded by the certainty that there would be no more after, we kissed as if everything had begun there, as if the world had paused just to watch us, even without seeing. You know, sometimes when I see my great-grandchildren playing in the garden, I think about that kiss. Not because I want to relive it. No, that's not it. It's because I realize that there are moments in life that shape us without asking permission. That kiss was my breakthrough, my first choice out of line. Before him, I was just a daughter, just a nurse, just obedient. After him, I was someone who dared to feel. And that act, however brief it may have been, transformed everything in me. It was a kiss of war, yes, but not of destruction. It was a kiss of construction, of revelation, and of farewell. The next morning we pretended nothing had happened. He passed me in the hallway as always, with that half-smile that kept secrets. I continued handing out syringes and taking temperatures as if my entire body wasn't on fire. No one knew. No one would ever know. The forbidden love we shared was kept silent, like so many stories of forgotten heroines that never made it into the newspapers or official speeches. But he knew. And I knew. We knew that that night would last longer than the rest of the war. And that, even if the bombs fell silent, even if peace was signed, we would both continue to carry that kiss in our souls. Because that was all we had left, a stolen moment in the dark. And everything that was denied, everything that would never be possible, stayed there, in that curve of lips that met and then lost each other. I never told anyone about that night. Not my husband, not my sister, not my friends at the synagogue, who spent their whole lives crocheting and talking about family recipes. That was the only piece of me that I kept whole. Just mine. And now, at 80-something years old, writing with fingers stained with time and a heart still warm, I realize that maybe it's time to share, because moving stories like this shouldn't die hidden, not out of vanity, but because they prove that, even in times of destruction, love persists. And if you've come this far, my dear, it's because you also believe that there are kisses that survive wars, trials, and even death. But look, I still haven't told you what happened when they asked me to deny knowing him. And that's where this story changes color. We think we know what loyalty is, until the day we are confronted with fear. And fear, oh, fear can dress up in many ways. Sometimes it comes as a bomb, sometimes as a look from a superior. But the most cowardly fear is the one that arrives in uniform, with curt orders, and a "yes, ma'am" at the end. And that's how he came to me that day. An officer, tall, with a steely gaze. He looked at me over the pad of paper I was holding and said, without hesitation, "You don't know him, understand? Nurses don't get involved." That was when I saw Benjamin being carried by 2 soldiers into the tent. The stretcher creaked, the sheet was stained with blood, and his face, that face I knew as if it were my own mirror, was covered in dirt, sweat, and silence. He was injured, badly. He had been ambushed while on patrol. And I froze. My heart went silent. My hands, which until then had been sewing cuts with tailor's precision, were shaking like a flag in a gale. It was him, my Benjamin. And all I could do was shake my head and say, "Yes, sir. I don't know him." That wasn't just a lie. It was a birth, a tearing apart of the soul, a forbidden love, now choked between military orders and the hope of seeing him survive. I denied it. I denied the name I whispered so many nights. I denied the touches, the kiss under the unlit lanterns, the piece of me that caught fire just seeing him enter my life. And he looked at me. He was conscious, despite the pain. He saw me, and he said nothing. But his eyes, oh, those eyes, asked me everything. And they understood everything too. There, at that moment, I was less of a nurse and more of a coward. But who would be brave in that scenario? I was just a woman, with a red cross sewn on my sleeve, and a star hanging around my neck, trying to survive in a world where even love was considered a crime. I was taught to obey, to respect hierarchies, to keep the honor of the uniform above the desires of my heart. But no one taught me what to do when the order was to deny a war love that was already sewn inside my chest. As the other nurses rushed to stop his bleeding, I took a step back, as if the ground was pushing me down. I couldn't touch him. I couldn't say his name. I had to act like I was just another soldier, a number, a statistic in the chaos, and that was what hurt the most. Watching the man I loved become a number in front of me, while I bit my tongue to keep from running up to him and saying, "Stay with me, please. Fight." I stood at a distance, watching every move. They intubated him, administered morphine, bandaged his injured shoulder with the haste of someone who had no time to care. And me? I wanted to cry, but crying would be confessing. So I squeezed my eyes shut, swallowed everything, and went to get more bandages, as if this were just another ordinary shift, as if my heart wasn't bleeding more than his. Have you ever seen denial hurt more than loss? Because I have, and I have lived it. Denying Benjamin that day was like cutting myself with a blunt scalpel. I repeated in my head, "It's for him. It's to protect him. If they find out, they'll send him away. They'll punish him. They'll separate us forever." But what I didn't know was that forever was already counting down. Forever has a treacherous way of seeming eternal, when in fact it only lasts a few hours. And sometimes, not even that. After he was stabilized and transferred to the critical care ward, I went back to my tent. I sat on the ground, between muddy boots and field blankets, and rested my forehead on my knees. I didn't pray. I didn't cry. I just sat there, mentally repeating everything I hadn't said, as if silent words had some healing power. That night I sat on the bench in the infirmary. It was my turn to watch over those who were unconscious. I walked over to the bed where Benjamin had been placed, and there he was, pale, breathing heavily, alone. No one knew that. Between those two wounded bodies there was a moving story that would never be told out loud. A story made up of elbow bumps, lingering glances, and a shirt forgotten in the trailer. I wanted to touch his hand. I wanted to rest my forehead against his and say, "Forgive me for denying you. Forgive me for being weak. Forgive me for still loving you when I'm not allowed to." But I didn't do any of that. I just stood there, staring at him like he was a painting about to be covered in dark paint. And then, slowly, I whispered, not his name, but mine, just so that if his soul was still wandering around, he would know that I was there, that I was never really gone. The next morning he was transferred. They didn't let me know where. They said that command had decided that I should focus on the living. That sentence, "Focus on the living," it tore me apart. Because I knew that since that I don't know him, something in me had died too. Something that neither the years, nor grandchildren, nor wedding anniversaries could resurrect. Since then, every time someone asks me what the hardest day of the war was, I smile and say, "When it ended." But the truth? I only tell the truth here, in this belated letter. The hardest day was when they asked me to deny that I knew him, and I obeyed. But what came next? Oh, what came next was even more devastating. When they delivered the crate, they didn't look me in the eye. They just said, "This was the last batch from the western sector. This is what's left." And they placed the wooden box on the counter as if they were leaving something that didn't belong to anyone. As if it were just a lost volume, an object of war, with no name, no history, no associated pain. But I knew, the moment I saw that piece of tricolor fabric folded with military precision. I knew. Benjamin couldn't resist. There was no official letter, not a visit from a conduct officer. Nothing, because in the eyes of the army, I was nothing to them. No paper said that we had anything other than the coincidence of being on the same base. And war, that merciless lady, only recognized stamped bonds. Forbidden love is not recorded in the minutes. Kisses extinguished by the lanterns are not proof of anything, and what is not proof is discarded. I sat in the corner of the ward. The other girls continued with the bandages, the measurements, the shifts. Life, as always, went on. But inside me, everything had stopped. The flag, the same one that should have been a symbol of victory or heroic mourning, was now a cruel joke, because it had arrived. But he doesn't. Folded, clean, intact, while the man I loved must have been covered in dust under some unknown ground, or maybe not even that. Maybe not even his body had returned. That flag was my certificate of widowhood without rights, a clandestine mourning. And I couldn't even cry. I stood there, motionless, with my hands in my lap, the same way I saw so many women sitting at the door of their houses, waiting for their men to return. But I didn't wait, because I knew, because I was the one who denied him. I was the one who silenced his existence when he most needed to be recognized. And that was my sentence. The flag remained there for days. No one knew for sure who it belonged to. Private Levi, Battalion 84, they said. No family contacts identified. And I, the only person who could shout, "I knew him," kept quiet. Because if I had, everything would have come out. My heart, my cowardice, my guilt. So I let the flag be stored in some closet, a closet with so many other belongings of men who also had no one to claim them. He was kept with the anonymous ones, and that destroyed me more than if I had been told he never existed. For a long time I kept returning to that closet in secret. On my night shifts, when the camp slept and the bush crickets whispered their laments, I would open the creaky wooden door and touch the folded fabric. I never had the courage to take it with me. Maybe out of fear of being discovered. Maybe because I didn't think I deserved it. But the touch, the touch reconnected me. It was like holding her hand, cold and still, for the last time. And it's strange, how something as symbolic as a flag can become so personal. That was no longer the country's flag. It was the flag of a wartime love that could never be declared. It was the last vestige of a man who smiled at me behind the tent, who forgot his shirt in my trailer, who said my name as if asking for shelter. The war took him, but the oblivion, I was the one who allowed it. I dreamed that same week that someone knocked on the door of the barracks asking for him. An elderly lady in a dark dress and with trembling hands. She said she was Benjamin's aunt. She wanted to know where the body was. I looked at her, unable to speak, and when she finally said, "I loved him," she disappeared. She always woke up in a cold sweat, with the feeling that something had been left behind. And that was true. That was all. You know what's worse? Not having anyone to share your grief with. Not being able to wear black, not being able to miss a shift, not being able to say, "He was mine." It's a kind of loneliness that doesn't fit into any definition. It's as if the world were saying, "You don't have the right to suffer." But pain doesn't ask for permission. It settles in, it throbs, and it doesn't need official recognition to exist. I continued with my life. I did my shifts. I did what I was told. A month later, I was transferred. And the flag? It stayed there. In the closet. Like it. Like us. And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't go back to get it. They told me that the base was dismantled years later. Maybe someone threw it all away. Maybe it was burned. Or, who knows? Maybe it was donated to a museum without knowing its true history. But inside me, that flag never left. It remained folded among my memories, among the layers of silence that I have piled up over time. It is here now, as I write. Invisible, but present. Like a handkerchief that no one sees, but that the soul continues to wear. Sometimes when the wind comes through the window and lifts the curtains in my room, I imagine that Benjamin is passing by me, not in the form of pain, but as if he were coming to get what was left pending, and I find myself muttering, without realizing it, "Pardon me, not for having loved him, but for having let him go as if he had never existed. And if you, who are listening to this, still don't understand, there are promises that we make not with words, but with silence. And it was in one of these silences that I promised my mother that I would return intact. But that's another story. Before leaving, she called me to the living room window. It was late afternoon. The sun was shining on her face from the side and highlighting every line of time in her expression. The whole house smelled of onions browning in butter, like every Friday before Shabbat. My mother had steady hands, always busy, always washing, always folding, always imposing an invisible order on the world. She looked at me as if weighing her own daughter's soul, and said in that deep, soft voice, "Anna, you'll come back in one piece, you hear? With your head held high, the honor of our house intact. Don't go getting lost out there. A smart girl doesn't let herself be seduced by sentimental confusion in times of war." I nodded. I said, "I promise," even though I knew deep down that promise had already been torn apart before I even left the house. My mother wasn't a woman who gave many hugs. She was more the type to adjust the collar of her coat tightly, as if that gesture were a blessing in disguise. She didn't say "I love you" with words. She said it with well-seasoned broths, with prayers at the bedroom door, with questions about whether I had slept well. But love in our house came with rules. Love was protection and restraint. And for her, a decent woman was a woman who knew where not to tread. I stepped. Benjamin was my first break, not with a scandal, not with knocking on the door, but with silence, with lingering eyes, with a cotton shirt that I hid in the luggage of my heart. I broke the promise like someone who loosens a thread in a seam, almost without meaning to, almost without realizing it. But when I realized it, it was too late. I was already crumpled with longing and overflowing with a forbidden love that would never fit into my mother's vocabulary. When I returned from the barracks months later, she was in the kitchen, as usual. The radio was on, the kettle was whistling, and she was wearing an apron, beating eggs with more force than necessary. When she saw me, she gave me a small, restrained smile. She came over to me, smoothed my hair, which had already been cut short by my uniform, and said, "You're in one piece. How nice. I knew you'd come back like this, straight, without stains." I smiled too, a fake smile, of the lips, not the soul, and inside, I bled, because I had come back, yes, but with a world that had been torn apart inside my chest. She never knew. I never asked her if she wanted to know. There was no room between us for exciting stories involving romance, disobedience, and pain. For my mother, war was an episode from which her daughter came out alive. And that was enough. She didn't ask about the wounded. She didn't ask about the dead. And most of all, she didn't ask if I had loved. Maybe because she already knew. Or maybe because, if she heard it from my mouth, she would have to face the idea that her little girl had loved beyond the permitted limits. So, I kept everything. The story, the kiss, the shirt, even the folded flag, left at the base. I kept in my mind, as if I still carried it in the folds of the jacket I wore on my last shift. And every time my mother said she was proud that I was an honorable girl, I said, "Thank you," and bit inside at the memory of having denied the only man who saw me beyond the lab coat. You know, time does strange things to guilt. At first it burns, then it whispers, and finally it hides in gestures. Like when I turned down every marriage proposal that came my way over the next 2 years. Or when I finally accepted a kind husband, but one with whom I never shared the name, Benjamin. The promise I made to my mother was fulfilled. On paper. I came back intact. But only on the outside. Inside, I was full of invisible seams. And that promise, that sentence spoken between the window and the tea table, was like a vow of silence that haunted me for decades. Because women like my mother, women who had survived migration, scarcity, the loss of their own brothers in previous wars, these women taught their daughters not to feel too much, not to want too much, not to expect too much. And I wanted all of that. With Benjamin, I wanted. I waited. I felt too much. I never got to tell her the truth. Not when my mother got sick. Not when she held my hand when I was weak in the hospital. She looked at me tenderly and said, "You were good, Anna. You were strong. You were clean." And all I could do was squeeze her hand tighter, as if I were somehow apologizing for every part of me she never knew. For every war I fought in silence. For every love story I had to hide, even from her. Maybe if I had told her, she would have forgiven me. Maybe she would have understood that love is not confusion, that love in times of war is not weakness, but an act of resistance. But I didn't have the courage, because deep down, I was still the daughter who wanted to be seen with pride, the daughter who promised to return without blemishes, the daughter who forgot that, sometimes, blemishes are precisely what make us human. And it was in this conflict, between the daughter who obeys and the woman who loves, that I spent a good part of my life, keeping a name in my chest and silence on my lips. Because, you see, being a forgotten heroine is not just a matter of a medal. Sometimes it is a matter of keeping quiet, but even silent promises one day start to hurt. And that night, many years later, when I dreamed of Benjamin standing at my door, that's what I understood. That silence didn't save me. It only delayed the scream. But I still haven't told you what happened when he came back, in my dreams. It was an ordinary night, nothing foretold that my soul would tremble. I was married, with 2 small children and a husband who snored softly beside me, in a well-ventilated room at the back of the house. We had flowery curtains, sheets bleached with lavender water, and a routine that fit well with the standards of the time. Milk in the morning, trips to the market on Saturdays, simple dinners and daily gratitude for stability. I was, on the outside, the picture of a settled woman. But that night, Benjamin came back. He didn't speak. He just appeared. He was at my door, wearing a wrinkled cotton shirt, the same one I still dreamed of touching, and a silent look in his eyes. He wasn't carrying a weapon, nor anger, nor regret. He was carrying absence, an absence so present that it made my entire body shiver in my dream. My bare feet moved toward him, and when I reached out my hand, I woke up, before I could touch him, before I knew what he wanted to tell me. The next morning I looked at the chair next to the bed, and for a second I imagined that his shirt was there, folded. It was only a second, but it was enough to break down the dam I had built over the years. I made the coffee with shaking hands. I didn't say anything to my husband. The boys were running around the room with toy cars. And there I was, feeling that part of my body was still inside that dream. Or rather, inside that war. The dream came back several times. Always in the same format. He would knock on the door, look at me. Sometimes he would smile, sometimes not. Sometimes the wind would blow his hair. Other times it was as if time had stopped around him. But in none of the versions did he speak, and in none of them could I touch him. It was as if the universe offered me the outline of a moving story, and then took it away before the end. I spent years like this, years in which this dream would repeat itself whenever life outside became too quiet. When the children got sick, or when the neighbors left, or when my husband hugged me without noticing that my body no longer hugged him back. It was in these empty moments that Benjamin would return, as if his soul knew that I hadn't yet let him go, as if he himself hadn't completely left. The fourth or fifth time the dream repeated itself, I began to wonder, was it just my subconscious? Or was it trying to tell me something? It may seem silly, but women like me learn to hear what's not said. They learn to read signs, to recognize silences, to decipher the gestures of those who can never stay. And this repeated nocturnal silence, with the smell of war and the taste of loss, was so strong that I began to treasure its visits as if they were unsent letters. I never told anyone about it, not my sister, not my best friend from school, not the rabbi. It was too intimate a secret to share. I cradled it like a reliquary. When night fell and silence took over the house, I would go to bed early just to see if he would come back. And he did. Sometimes with sad eyes, other times with his hands in his pockets, looking like a lost boy. I once dreamed that he was in my kitchen, the same one where I prepared the soups of my children's childhood. He sat on the wooden chair and watched me in silence, while I cut vegetables that never fell apart. The knife passed through the carrot, but it remained whole. And he simply said with his eyes, "It's not too late." I woke up with the taste of tears on my lips, and my hands clenched around the sheets. I stayed there staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what it meant to dream about someone the whole world had forgotten, except me. You know, some people say that time erases everything. But I learned that time doesn't erase. It organizes. It just piles feelings into different boxes. But sometimes, a box opens on its own. And Benjamin was that box, one that I never had the courage to throw away. And with every dream, he would come to remind me that he was still there, that there was still a part of me that hadn't been buried, a part that was still waiting for a touch that never came. I began writing about these dreams in old notebooks, by hand, with pens that failed mid-sentence. I wrote down the time he woke up, what he was wearing, the position of his body. It was like trying to capture a scent before it vanished into the air. Each entry was an attempt to keep Benjamin alive, at least on the fringes of my lucidity. And the more he came back, the more I understood that my mourning was never complete. Did I cry for him? Yes, but in secret. Did I pray for him? Maybe, on nights when my soul spoke louder than my reason. But experiencing mourning, acknowledging mourning, was never allowed to me. And the dream came to fulfill this function, to give me permission, to give me a place where I could see him, where I could feel him, without guilt, without a burden, without broken promises. And now, so many years later, I understand. That dream was not just a visit. It was resistance. It was a reminder that the story we lived, even if it was clandestine, was not an illusion. It was forbidden love, yes, but it was real. And that many forgotten heroines like me may have also received nocturnal visits from their silenced loves. Because this is what war love is like. It does not die with the body. It buries itself in the gaps of sleep, in the cracks of the unconscious, in the scars that no one sees. To this day, every now and then, when the night is cold and the world seems to recede from my tired eyes, I fall asleep with one last thought. Will he come back today? And even without knowing, I hope. But if you think the story ends in the dream, no, because there is a box in the attic that no one knows about, and it is there that things take shape. All my life I've been told to only keep what is useful, what has value, what serves a purpose. But I've learned over time that there are things that are no longer useful for anything, except to keep the soul whole. And that's exactly what's stored inside the shoebox in the attic. A brown box, faded by time, with worn edges and a loose lid. A box that no one knows about. Not my children, not my grandchildren, not the man with whom I've shared 50 years of marriage and no true confidences. I go up there every now and then. The attic has that smell of damp wood and old paper that seems to tell secrets just by being inhaled. The floor creaks beneath my feet, and sometimes when I open the hatch, the wind kicks up dust that dances like a memory. It's almost a ritual. I go up there alone, always with a scarf around my neck, even in the summer. I sit down slowly on the old straw chair and place the box on my lap, and before I open it, I take a deep breath, because opening that box is like going back to war. There's not much inside. It doesn't need to be. There's a loose button, the button from Benjamin's shirt, which I sewed on with heavy thread back then, but which fell off after the third wash. I've kept it like a jewel. It's round and beige with 2 small rust marks around the central hole. When I touch it, I feel the warmth of his hands. Hands that handed me a cup of coffee on a cold day of vigil. Hands that touched my face once, briefly, behind the supply tent, as if the world were about to interrupt us. There's also a note, short, written in a hurried hand on inventory paper. It's crumpled, with stains that could be from coffee or time. It says, "If we make it back alive, meet me by the barn on the 3rd day. B." That's all. A sentence that never came true. A future that never happened. I read and reread that note more times than I can count. Some days it sounded like hope. Other days it sounded like mockery. But I could never get rid of it, because it was the only time he had left me something written. And that was already a lot. At the bottom of the box is a small folded map. A hand-drawn sketch with crooked lines and coded directions. He used to draw these routes on night shifts. Not as a mission, but as a distraction. It was a habit. He said that it helped him imagine escape routes, possible ways back, ways to survive when everything seemed hopeless. And on one of these routes, he drew a small star in the bottom corner. I asked him what it was, and he said, "It's you. My route back, I kept it. Because if it couldn't be destiny, at least it would be the memory. Sometimes when I'm most tired, I think about burning this box, getting rid of everything, freeing up space, both physical and emotional. But then I take the button between my fingers and think, what if that's all I have left of him? Because Benjamin never had a grave. He never had a portrait. He never had a farewell. He was absorbed by the war like so many other good men, whose names did not enter the books and whose loves were hidden in the cellars of history. And this box is my private sanctuary. It is where I grieve, where I talk to him, even in silence. My grandchildren run around the house with their colorful backpacks and their cell phones that vibrate all the time. When they ask me for war stories, I tell them a few. The light ones, the acceptable ones. I tell them about the wounded who survived, about comrades who sang at night, about soldiers who wrote letters to their wives and asked me to check their spelling. But I never tell them about the box. I never tell them about the kiss behind the tent. I never tell them about the day I denied him to save my own skin, and perhaps doomed him, because some emotional stories only make sense when they are told too late. Because it takes time to recognize the weight of silence, and even more time to understand that some memories are not healed. They are only carried with more care. And that is what I do with this box. I carry it, not to punish myself, but to remember that I loved, that I was loved, even if only for a brief time. And you know what? Sometimes I think about leaving that box out in the open, leaving it in the middle of the living room like handing over a forgotten puzzle piece. Maybe one of my grandchildren will find it one of those days, when they come to pick up Christmas decorations or boxes of old photographs. Maybe they'll open it, touch the button, read the note, and ask, "Who was that, Grandma?" And then maybe I'll answer, or maybe I'll just smile like my mother used to and say, "Thing of other times, my dear," because there are stories that, even when told, remain secrets. But for now, the box goes back to the corner, among old curtains and faceless dolls, because the right moment hasn't arrived yet. But he will come, maybe, when I sit, once again, on the wooden bench at the end of the street. I'm not sure when I started going there every day. All I know is that after the kids grew up and the noises in the house died down, that bench at the end of the street started calling to me, as if it knew I needed a place that didn't ask for anything, that would just let me sit. And remember, it was a simple bench, made of old wood, painted white some summer ago, with exposed splinters and creaking screws. But to me, it was always more than a bench. It was the place where I talked to him. Not out loud, of course. The words never escaped my mouth. But inside me, there in that space between the trees and the neighbor's sunflower field, I reconstructed our interrupted conversations. I talked about the news of the day, the pains of aging, the grandson who passed the college entrance exam, the apple cake that didn't turn out as good as the one from the week before. And mainly, I talked about what was left pending, the what-ifs that still echoed in my nights, the forbidden love that refused to become just a memory. For 20 years I went there almost every day, sometimes with a blanket on my lap, sometimes with knitting needles, sometimes just with my thoughts running wild. Some afternoons were too hot, others too cold. But I never stopped going, because that bench was the only place where my story didn't have to fit into the mold of what was acceptable. There, I was free to love Benjamin as many times as I wanted, to cry for him, without asking the world for permission. There, he had never died. He was just late. There was a winter when I was sick and couldn't go out for weeks. The bed held me back. My body wouldn't obey, and my head throbbed as if it were too full of memories. And what hurt the most wasn't the fever or the aching joints. It was the absence of the bench. I missed that blank space where I could be who I truly was. A woman who loved in silence. A woman who still waited, even after so many decades. The first time I returned after my recovery, the bench felt as if it had missed me too. The seat creaked more than usual, and there were dry leaves piled up on the side. I sat down slowly with a long sigh and closed my eyes. The wind touched my gray hair like familiar hands. And there, amid the sound of the birds and the rustling of the leaves, I heard something I had never heard before. The sound of my own longing, at peace. It was as if he were sitting next to me. Not like a ghost, not like an apparition, but like an ancient presence that knows exactly when to return. Benjamin never appeared physically, of course. But sometimes when the late afternoon light turned everything around orange and the world seemed suspended by a thread of silence, I felt as if he were there. Maybe with the same cotton shirt, the same smile on his face. And I talked to him, not with words, but with thoughts. Thoughts that became more real than many conversations I had in my life. I once took one of my grandsons there. He was small, curious, and full of whys. He asked why I always sat on the same bench. I smiled and said, it's my favorite place." He insisted, "But why?" And I said, "Because it's where my heart rests." He didn't understand, of course. Children don't need to understand everything. Sometimes they just need to listen with their hearts. And that's what he did. He sat next to me, in silence, and we sat there, both of us looking at the field, as if we were waiting for something that only I knew what it was. The years passed. The bench was replaced twice by the city council. New wood, new paint, slightly different shape. But I always knew which was my bench, because it wasn't about the wood. It was about what I left there. It was about the sound of waiting, the sound of those who don't forget, the sound of an exciting story that didn't end when the war ended, nor when my youth left, nor when the world told me it was time to move on. On cloudy days, I usually take a blanket and a bottle of chamomile tea. I sit, watch the people passing by, and just stay there, with the box of memories open inside my chest. Sometimes I see couples holding hands, young people with headphones, old women walking with canes. And I think, how many of us carry untold loves? How many forgotten heroines like me sit on benches like this with their chests full of stories that no one will ever hear? But I hear myself. And more than that, I hear Benjamin. I hear the sound of what he might have said if he had had the time. And maybe that's what keeps me alive inside, knowing that, even in silence, our love never went away. It just changed places. It left the unsent letters and sat beside me, every day, on that wooden bench. One day I stood there until the sun had completely disappeared. The neighbor saw me and asked if everything was okay. I smiled, as always. I said yes, but deep down, I knew. It had been the most beautiful day ever. Because that afternoon, for the first time, I felt him answering me. Not with words, but with a warm breeze, a leaf that fell from above and landed on my lap. It was his way of saying, "I'm still here." And now that my steps are slower, that my breathing is heavier on the stairs, I keep going there. Sometimes I carry a notebook, sometimes just the memory, but I always carry Benjamin, because that bench is the place where my life finds meaning. But look, there's still something you need to know, something I've only just given myself permission to write, because today I'm writing a letter, one that maybe someone will find, one that begins like this. Benjamin, if you're out there somewhere, if someone ever searches through the drawers of my room and finds this folded sheet, don't be alarmed by the shaky handwriting or the yellowed paper. Don't think it's just a lonely lady's scribble or another unimportant memory left behind. This letter, this one, which now flickers between my fingers like a candle at the end of its flame, is everything I haven't said in 80 years. Everything I've had to hide, even from myself. Everything I've been, in silence. Benjamin, if you are there, somewhere, in the sky, in time, or in the invisible folds of memories, listen now, because this is me, Anna, your Anna, calling you back with the voice that war silenced. And it doesn't matter if no one else knows. It doesn't matter if the world never saw us together, or recognized what we were. I know. And you knew too. Because what we live doesn't need to be long to be eternal. A kiss was enough. A whisper was enough. The courage to feel was enough, even when everything around us told us to deny it. Today my bones are more fragile than my longing. My steps are short. My vision blurs when the day ends. And my hands, the same ones that tended wounds and hid buttons, now tremble as I write. But my heart, Benjamin, my heart still remembers, and it is with my heart that I write to you, as if you were still on the other side of the radio, listening to me, as if there were still time, as if we could still meet near the barn on the third day. I kept everything about you, with the care that perhaps no one can understand. The button, the note, the map. But what I kept most was our silent promise, the one that was born in that kiss under the unlit lanterns. The promise to exist, even in the impossible. And yes, I was yours, even in silence, even in denial, even in lying to protect myself. Because deep down, the truth never stopped living inside me, like an underground river, silent, but constant. You had no funeral, no coffin, no headstone. And I had no flowers to leave, but I had memories. I had dreams. I had wooden benches where I sat waiting for an answer that came, sometimes, in the form of a breeze, sometimes in the sound of rain, sometimes in the look of a stranger on the street who vaguely reminded me of you. I had a lifetime of pauses and sighs that only you would understand. If anyone finds this letter, let them understand. There are moving stories that don't need an audience. That forbidden love is not a lesser love. It's just love that fought harder. That forgotten heroines exist on every corner, in every ward, in every memory the world prefers not to hear. But we exist, and our story existed. No matter how short, how muffled, how silent it may have been. Benjamin, today I no longer expect you to knock on the door. But I still leave the window open, you know? Out of habit, out of affection, out of faith. Maybe the wind decides to bring me one last sign. Maybe this letter, written with velvet hands and a heart full of dust, finds its way to you. I lived. Yes, I lived. Not in the way we dreamed. But I lived long enough to know that what we had made me bigger. Made me more whole. Even though the world never saw me broken. Even though not even my mother knew that I had loved. Even though no one, not even my grandchildren, knows her name. But now it's here. Written, Benjamin Levi. And if this letter survives me, may it carry your name forward. Even if it is only in a whisper, in the corner of a drawer, in a forgotten envelope. Because there are names that deserve to be said. And yours is the first on my list. I close my eyes now, with this letter on my lap and my head resting on the armchair. I hear the creaking of the wood in the house and the sound of the clock on the wall, marking another hour that has passed. The world continues to turn, as it always has. But here inside, where you still live, everything is quiet. And maybe that's it, Benjamin. Maybe true eternity lies in the letters we don't send, but that still find the right heart. So, if anyone finds this letter, read it calmly. Hold it like someone holding an old hand. Fold it lovingly. And if you can, tell this story to someone else. Because what is not told gets erased. And you, my love, don't deserve to be erased. With everything I didn't say. With everything I've been, your Anna. You know, time doesn't erase things. It just covers with dust what we haven't yet had the courage to face. For so many years I thought silence would protect me. That if I didn't say it out loud, the pain would go away. But some stories don't want to be forgotten. They wait. They wait until we get old enough to tell them without fear. Today I live slowly. My grandchildren come to visit me on Sundays, and sometimes they sit on the living room rug, asking for stories about when I was young. I speak of light things, of the nurses who sang, of the smell of bread baked in the camp tents. But this story, this one, I only told you. Because for some reason I can't explain, I felt that you would listen with your heart. Now that it's been said, I feel like a part of me can finally rest. Maybe Benjamin heard me too. Maybe he didn't. But if he listens to me, let him know. I have not forgotten him. Never. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If you can, listen to me again sometime. If this story touched you, enjoy it with love and share it with someone who also carries hidden memories. And if you want to come back, the door to my house is always ajar until the next story. With all that's left of me,